He stepped out of the wardrobe with a loaded firearm and a look on his face his wife had never seen before. At first, she thought it was for protection, but what happened next turned their home into a scene of pure horror. Let's uncover the twisted unraveling of Neil Jacobson's mind, the brutal murders of his own family, and the shocking courtroom defense that tried to excuse it all. Neil Jacobson seemed to have it all: a thriving career in mortgage banking, a beautiful home in New Jersey, and a woman by his side who shared his ambitions. When he met Frankie, things moved fast. Marriage, a life built on adventure and financial success. It looked like a picture-perfect dream, but perfection is an illusion. And behind the polished image, cracks were forming that no one would have ever known. From the outside, Neil and Frankie were the ideal power couple. Both had successful careers in finance, and they indulged in an adventurous lifestyle, bicycling through scenic trails, diving into the deep blue, and escaping on luxurious weekend getaways. But there was something they couldn't buy, something that ate away at them for years: infertility. What started as hope quickly spiraled into an exhausting cycle of treatments, disappointments, and emotional devastation. Each failed attempt deepened the tension between them, and when people crack under pressure, they either come together or they break apart. After years of crushing disappointment, the impossible happened. In 2003, they welcomed twin boys, Joshua and Eric. Their friends and family thought this was the turning point, the moment when all the pain would be replaced with joy. But happiness doesn't erase years of silent resentment. Neil was no longer just a husband, he was a father, and that meant expectations, sacrifices, and responsibilities that he may not have been prepared for. Frankie, once his partner in adventure, was now consumed by motherhood. The dynamic shifted, and not in a way that strengthened their bond. Neil thrived in the high-stakes world of finance, but success is a double-edged sword. The long hours, the stress, the demand to always be on top, it drained him. At home, the warmth between him and Frankie had turned cold. Arguments became routine, and soon, people started noticing that the man who once exuded confidence now seemed distracted, distant, agitated. Whispers of tension swirled. Some said he was drowning under the weight of it all: fatherhood, work, the crumbling marriage. Others speculated that Frankie wasn't as supportive as she appeared. But one thing was clear: the perfect life they had built was hanging by a thread. Success, love, a family. It was everything Neil had once wanted. So why did it all go so terribly wrong? The response would knock everyone who knew them off their feet. Because what happened next, no one could have predicted. And once the truth came out, there was no going back. It started with a decision that looked like love on the surface, but underneath, it was something else entirely. Neil Jacobson wasn't just a family man trying to be closer to his parents. He was a man chasing control, ignoring red flags, and dragging his entire family into a storm he refused to see coming. Back in 2000, his parents, Harold and Goldie, had moved to sunny Florida. But by 2005, when Harold was diagnosed with cancer, Neil unraveled. The idea of being far from his dad became unbearable. That's when things started to shift. Neil convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that moving the family south was the right call. But this wasn't about starting fresh. It was about desperation, and it was about money. Even before the big move, Neil had already sunk a fortune into Florida real estate. Not just one or two properties. He bought into several pre-construction condos. Sure, they'd skyrocket in value. Frankie wasn't sold. She saw the risks. But Neil didn't want to hear it. He was all in, betting their future on something that wasn't even built yet. Frankie loved New Jersey. She had friends, a job, and a life there. But when the numbers stopped adding up, she caved. The financial pressure was closing in, and Neil made it clear there wasn't room for hesitation. So they packed up, left everything familiar behind, and moved to Florida, chasing a dream Neil had already gambled too much on. But the fresh start they were promised didn't last. Just 2 months after they arrived, Harold passed. The loss shattered Neil, but it also left Frankie holding everything else together: a grieving husband, 2 young boys, and a house built on risky investments. It was all falling apart faster than she could catch it. Most people thought Neil started falling apart after his dad died. But the truth? He started to fall apart since childhood. According to his own mother, Neil was never quite okay. Even as a kid, he obsessed over being the perfect child. Not just good, flawless. If something didn't go exactly the way he planned, it ate at him. That mindset didn't go away. It evolved. As an adult, it turned into obsessive habits and sky-high expectations. For himself, for Frankie, for their kids. Everything had to match the image in his head. If it didn't, He couldn't handle it. Neil poured his life savings into Florida real estate, convinced he'd found a gold mine. But when the Great Recession hit, that gold mine turned into a sinkhole. The market tanked, condos sat empty, and the value of everything he'd bought? It nosedived. He didn't just lose money, he lost control. The business he'd built from the ground up was collapsing. The deals he once bragged about were bleeding cash. Meanwhile, the subprime mortgage rates he'd counted on, they skyrocketed, and suddenly, every investment looked like a massive mistake. As the numbers got worse, Neil did too. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't thinking clearly. Everything revolved around fixing the mess. But the more he tried, the deeper it got. Frankie, who had doubted the move from the start, now found herself trapped in a financial nightmare, one she never signed up for. Neil refused to admit he was wrong. He pushed harder, made riskier moves, ignored reality. And behind closed doors, his behavior became erratic. He wasn't just stressed, he was losing his grip. Even as the pressure crushed their household, Neil clung to the idea of being perfect. He couldn't accept failure. He couldn't admit weakness. And that obsession? It cost them everything. Instead of fixing things, he buried them. Instead of opening up, he shut down. Frankie tried to hold it together, but Neil wasn't listening. He didn't want help. He wanted control. And when control slipped through his fingers, he did what a man would normally do: dig deeper. Because this wasn't just a financial downfall. It was a total collapse of a man, a marriage, and a mask he'd worn for decades. Remember, if you are a true crime fan like I suspect you are, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more cases and updates on cases like this one. Neil had prided himself on being the guy who always had a plan. No matter the problem, he'd find a solution. But this time, he was out of options and out of time. The financial freefall was happening faster than he could spin another story. And the truth? He was drowning. Neil had stacked his life on borrowed time. For mortgages, and barely a trickle of income left him scrambling. It wasn't just stress, it was a ticking clock. The bills never stopped, and neither did the calls. Debt collectors, late notices, warnings, it all came crashing in, louder by the day. At first, they dipped into savings like it was just a rough patch. But it wasn't. It was a black hole. The account drained quicker than anyone expected. Frankie tried to stay calm, but even she could see the writing on the wall. Their safety net? Gone. Their backup plan? There wasn't one. Desperate and panicked, Neil made reckless choices. He chased shady deals, begged for loans, and tried unloading properties that were already worth less than they owed. Nothing worked. Every move made things worse. Instead of cutting losses, Neil doubled down, dragging Frankie and the boys deeper into the mess. With no money left and no future in sight, Frankie made the call Neil refused to. She stopped paying the mortgages on their Florida condos. Not because she wanted to, but because there was nothing left to give. It was a breaking point, a silent admission that the dream Neil sold her on was never real to begin with. Because when the money ran out, something inside Neil snapped. And what he did next would change the story from tragedy to something far darker. At first, it looked like stress. Then it turned into something darker. Neil wasn't just overwhelmed. He was paranoid, unstable, and drifting into a world only he could see. The man who once ran a business was now locking himself in, whispering about surveillance and invisible threats. His sister, Deborah, saw it clearly. Neil wasn't Neil anymore. His behavior was erratic, his thoughts scattered. He barely spoke, barely moved, and when he did, it was only to voice fear. Frankie saw it too. She turned to her own sister for help, because living with him had become disturbing. Every day brought a new fear, a new obsession, a new breakdown. He stopped going outside, refused to see friends, barely spoke to his kids. Even his hygiene slipped away. This wasn't depression, it was a full breakdown. He claimed his phone was tapped, that his house was being watched, that agents were outside in unmarked vans. The walls he built around himself weren't for safety, they were a prison. Neil believed he was under investigation from the FBI, that federal agents were watching his every move, waiting to pounce. He whispered about being in big trouble, but couldn't explain why. He told his mother the FBI was on its way, his voice shaky, his eyes wide. But when she asked what he had done, he couldn't say. He didn't know. Or maybe he did, and just couldn't admit it. Whatever Neil was holding on to, his business, his ego, his sanity, was gone. What came next wouldn't just shake his family. It would expose just how far one man could fall when his world becomes one long, terrifying delusion. Everyone saw the signs. Friends felt the distance. But no one imagined how far gone he really was. Neil had crossed into a place where logic didn't matter, where fear ruled every move. And while his loved ones were scrambling to help him, Neil was quietly planning something they never saw coming. In his twisted mind, danger was everywhere. He believed people were after him, that his kids were at risk, that Frankie was hiding something. He stopped trusting anyone, especially the people closest to him. The same man who once said family meant everything was now convinced they were all better off gone. Frankie was exhausted, drained from the finances, the isolation, and now, Neil's paranoia. But she didn't know how far it had gone. She didn't know he was convinced the FBI would arrest him, or that he believed they'd take the kids away. She didn't know that in his warped logic, he thought there was only one way to stop it all. He had refused help for months. Wouldn't see a doctor, wouldn't see a therapist, wouldn't admit something was wrong. By the time his mother and sister realized how deep the break had gone, it was too late. The paranoia had hardened into belief. The fear had turned into obsession, and the man they once knew was gone. Because Neil didn't wait for the FBI. He didn't wait for the repo man or the next call from a bank. He took matters into his own hands. And what he did would shock an entire community and leave a stain on his family that would never wash away. It was just another quiet day in the Jacobson home. Nothing unusual, no screams, no signs of chaos. But behind the silence, Neil had made a decision. One that would end lives and leave a trail of devastation that no one could ever fix. Frankie was asleep. The kids were tucked in. That's when Neil acted. He didn't lash out in rage. He was calm, calculated, as if he truly believed he was saving them. In his mind, it wasn't murder. It was protection. From what? He never really said. But the outcome was irreversible. Frankie was gone. The house was silent, but Neil wasn't finished. Covered in insides, he reloaded his firearm one more time and turned toward the hallway. He wasn't thinking like a father. He was thinking like a man with nothing left to lose and no intention of letting anyone else survive. Neil walked into Eric's room. The child was asleep, peacefully, face down, completely unaware of the horror coming. Neil aimed and fired. 2 bullets ripped through Eric's small body. But somehow, Eric survived. He was still breathing, still fighting. Instead of stopping, Neil grabbed a pillow, held it over Eric's face, and pulled the trigger 2 more times. That was it. Eric's life, gone. No chance to wake up. No time to scream. No mercy. Just silence. Joshua was curled up in bed. Safe. Innocent. Dreaming. He didn't hear the earlier shots. Didn't know his brother was already gone. Neil didn't hesitate. He placed the pillow over Joshua's face and did the exact same thing. 2 shots, straight through. Just like that, both boys were gone. Joshua and Eric, his twin boys, his miracle children, the ones he had once fought so hard to bring into this world. He took them out of it without warning, without mercy. Whatever was left of Neil's sanity vanished in those moments. And what he did to Frankie afterward proved this wasn't a breakdown. It was destruction. She found her sons, and then she saw Neil. He didn't run, didn't deny it, just stood there, hollow and detached, like he had already left this world too. But he was still alive, and that meant he would have to answer for what he did, whether he understood it or not. The moment Frankie realized what Neil had done, instinct kicked in. She didn't hesitate. She launched herself at him, screaming, clawing, fighting for her life, and maybe for a last chance to protect what little she had left. But she wasn't up against the man she married. She was up against something darker. The struggle was brutal. They crashed to the floor, her hands grabbing for the weapon, his fists lashing out in rage. He didn't hold back. One hit shattered her front tooth. Another tore open her finger. But even bleeding and broken, Frankie didn't stop. She refused to die without a fight. He was stronger. And worse, he was calm, cold, like none of it mattered. While Frankie screamed, begged, and clawed for survival, Neil moved like a machine, focused, unshaken, like he had already made peace with the ending he'd chosen. With blood on the floor and desperation in the air, Neil overpowered her. And as if nothing had happened, he calmly reloaded the firearm. No emotion, no hesitation. Frankie, battered but still alive, could only watch. 2 POWs, straight to her face. And just like that, he silenced her forever. No goodbye, no mercy, just the final, heartless act in a horror story he created. And what he did next would leave even seasoned detectives speechless. The house was silent. The smell of firearm powder still hung in the air. When police entered the home, they found Neil on the floor, barely conscious, blood on his clothes, and the murder weapon still in his hand. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just there. His voice was faint, cracked, like he already knew there was no undoing what he had done. "I killed my family," he whispered. No emotion, no explanation, just a cold confession that sent chills through every officer in that room. Was this a sudden break, or something deeper? Detectives needed answers. And fast. The scene looked like rage, but the planning said otherwise. Neil had reloaded, moved room to room, methodically executed his own wife and children. That's not panic. That's premeditation. Some pointed fingers at his mental state. Others blamed medication. But none of that explained the cold, calculated nature of what he did. He didn't hesitate. He didn't spare anyone. He didn't even try to help afterward. He just sat there, like it was all part of some twisted plan. Was Neil Jacobson a broken man who finally lost it? Or was he something far worse? A man who chose control over compassion, even if it meant wiping out his own blood? And what the courtroom revealed next would force everyone to pick a side. Neil's trial wasn't about whether he did it. He already confessed. The question was why. And when it came time to explain the unthinkable, his defense team had one answer: blame the pills. They painted Neil as a man on the edge, crippled by depression, anxiety, and paranoia. They claimed his mind didn't just break on its own. They said it was pushed by medication, by chemicals, by side effects. In short, they argued Neil wasn't a killer. He was a victim. The defense leaned hard into the idea of psychosis. They brought in experts, testimony after testimony about how certain antidepressants can trigger delusions, and how, in rare cases, the line between reality and fear becomes blurred. But blurred lines don't explain 4 reloads. They don't explain silence or precision. They told the court Neil truly believed the government was watching him, that his phone was bugged, that his family was in danger, and with his finances crumbling and his grip on reality slipping, the drugs only made it worse. That was the story they told. But here's the problem. Frankie and the kids weren't hallucinations, and Neil never called for help. He didn't stop when the first shot was fired. He kept going until no one was left to stop him. Plenty of people struggle with mental health. Plenty take Zoloft, Xanax. They don't do what Neil did. They don't plan, reload, execute. This wasn't a blackout. It was a choice. And no medication can excuse that. After weeks of testimony, expert opinions, and endless attempts to shift the blame, it all came down to one thing: accountability. The jury didn't buy the sob story. They didn't see a victim. They saw a man who planned, who acted, and who never once tried to stop himself. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read: guilty of murdering Frankie, guilty of murdering Joshua, guilty of murdering Eric. No mercy, no sympathy, no confusion. The jury saw the truth for what it was. Neil Jacobson had made a decision, and now he would finally pay for it. His sister, his mother, friends, they couldn't defend him anymore. What he did was beyond reason, beyond forgiveness. Frankie's family sat in tears, hearing the words they waited so long to hear. Justice, finally. But no amount of sentencing would bring their loved ones back. No parole, no second chances. Just a cell and a lifetime to sit with what he did. But here's the truth. Neil's punishment started the moment he chose control over compassion. The moment he turned his fear into violence. That's when he stopped being a husband, a father, a man. And just like that, the mask came off. A man once seen as successful, devoted, even admirable, exposed as the very thing his family never saw coming. A calculated destroyer, a cold-blooded executioner. Because no excuse, no diagnosis, and no defense can erase what Neil Jacobson did. If stories like this leave you speechless, angry, or needing to know more, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We dive deep into the darkest corners of true crime every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.